Welcome back to our small group Advent study, week 2. This week we are focusing on faith, and our hymn is Wake, Awake, for Night is Flying. Wake, Awake, for Night is Flying is actually a hymn that's not listed under Advent in our hymnal, but it speaks to the themes of Advent nonetheless. This hymn was written by a pastor in the wake of the bubonic plague that swept through Europe, killing millions. At one point, Nikolai, this pastor, witnessed 30 or more burials a day. This inspired him to meditate on the afterlife. And then when one of his former students died of the plague, he actually wrote this hymn as a bridal song celebrating this former student and his union with Christ in death. In this hymn, the bride is the church and the groom is Christ, and the attendants are individual Christians. We, the singers, become the center of this beautiful religious drama played out between heaven and earth. The author wanted us to see that the second coming of Christ is something to rejoice in and not fear. It also includes connections between the Lord's Supper and the eternal wedding banquet of the Lamb, and uses themes from Revelation and the bridesmaids waiting for the bridegroom in Matthew 25. It speaks to the great faith of God's people in the promised resurrection. There's your history lesson for today.
Well, hello, Bethlehem Church. It is just such a nice day that I had to be outside because I'm guessing when you're watching this, it's not so nice. But for this meditation, can I start out by saying, I think having faith is hard. Well, it is. It's true. Having faith is hard. I think having faith is hard for a number of reasons, but a big reason for so many of us is that the concept of God is just really abstract. Let me ask you a question that I ask our confirmation students to talk about. This happens in the first week. What do we mean when we talk about God? Seriously, when you say God, what do you mean by that? How do you understand God? What images come to your mind? I actually ask our confirmation youth to draw a picture of this, and almost always they come up with an image of a guy, always a male, on a cloud with a beard looking down on the earth. It's the classical cartoon image of God, but the problem is that this image of God is not believable. It's not powerful. It's not that life-giving. For many of our confirmation students, God is about as real as the tooth fairy. So let me tell you a quick story to help illustrate this point. If there is any young children, or if there's any young children around, you should stop this video and relocate for reasons that will become clear in a moment. Are you good? Okay, I want to tell you a story about my kids and the tooth fairy. Both of my kids came to figure out that the tooth fairy was not real through the same experiment. After losing a tooth, they decided not to tell their mom or me. Instead, they simply put the tooth under their pillow and went to sleep. Because they did not say anything to either of us, of course, in the morning they looked under their pillow and the tooth was still there. When our oldest did this, she did not want to rush the experiment, so she left the tooth under her pillow the next night, and the night after that, and the night after that. And then on the morning of the fourth day, she came down and asked, "Mom, Dad, is the tooth fairy real?" And of course, we, her parents, said, "Of course the tooth fairy's real. Why are you asking that question?" And she said, "Because I put a tooth under my pillow 3 days ago and nothing happened." And we're like, "Oh, aren't you clever?" Emily and I have a ritual that we have developed when we talk to our kids about important topics. And when we were having this conversation about the tooth fairy, we told her about the fun tradition, but it wasn't real. When we confirmed her suspicion, I saw in her eyes a sad realization, a loss of innocence as she learned that these mythical creatures that brought joy in her life as a little child, how they weren't real. One of the next questions she asked then, is God real? Because God seems a lot like the tooth fairy, this thing that I cannot see but is supposed to help me and does good things for me. If God is two-dimensional, a character with a beard on a cloud, a puppet master pulling the strings in our life, if God is like the tooth fairy, if that's what we mean when we talk about God, then as an adult, it is really, really hard to have faith in that. As we think about this song we just heard, and remember that Nikolai was seeing 30 burials a day in the midst of so much loss and grief, we need a God who is so much bigger than the tooth fairy. A childhood faith simply does not work for us as adults. So when we talk about having faith in God, what do we mean when we talk about God? Jesus describes God as love, pure, unconditional love. Faith in a God who is love is deep and has the power to change everything about how we see ourselves, others, and the world. At this time, I would invite you to read the selected verses on your sheet and then follow up with the conversations or with the questions to generate conversation. I hope you enjoy this discussion and reflection on faith.
Please read and reflect on the following scripture texts. Matthew 25, verses 1 through 13. and Revelation 22, verses 16 through 21. Tonight's reflection questions. What do you mean when you talk about God? How would you describe God? Number 2, after living in the midst of the current pandemic, how do you imagine life would have been like for those living in medieval Europe with so much widespread death in such a short period of time? And 3, how does this hymn resonate with you?